For over 45 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll look at the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we're starting again with the situation in Pokrovsk. Russia announced just a few days ago that it had fully captured the city, confirmed that with footage from the city center, and there are now various new recordings, some of which must have pleased Putin greatly, while others represent a massive embarrassment for him. We'll start off with the kind of footage you might have anticipated. Scenes of Russian troops advancing in Pokrovsk, including Russian soldiers, some apparently hailing from Chechnya here, who are posing on the completely destroyed high-rises across the city, waving the Russian flag and the Kadyrov flag, proudly showing off here, as mentioned. We can see these are all recordings that were somewhat expected, since Russia did clearly state we've fully captured the city, with Peskov himself, Putin's spokesperson, confirming it. He basically announced it, said it was reported to Putin like that, and that it's now a fact. And so these recordings here might not be surprising, nor is it surprising that the Russians apparently remain completely indifferent toward the entire destruction here. We can also see here a roughly 10-story high-rise, obviously no civilians living there anymore, all the roofs completely destroyed, yet Russian soldiers still climb up and pose on top, proudly celebrating their so-called victory with flags and gestures. Let's first take a look at the map to see why this here only represents just one part of the entire picture. Because all the footage we've seen so far of the Russian army from Pokrovsk is located entirely south of the railway line, south of the key railway line that once came from the west, from Dnipropetrovsk, connecting Pokrovsk to Mirnohrad and later on also to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And this railway line, which we can try to illustrate here, runs right through the city, closely following the full route of the main road that stretches across this entire area. And all the footage we've just seen of the Russian invaders actually comes entirely from this specific area. That means it's the area we just saw, where the high-rises were at least partly still standing, where they were occupied. The footage from the city center that we also saw, taken by Russian soldiers, is from this area. So this here is the center of Pokrovsk. That means we can assume that most parts of Pokrovsk, including the administrative center, the cultural hub of the city, and also the area there, where most residents lived back then, are under Russian control. But there is something very interesting. Let's look at another video. And this particular video was actually recorded just north of the railway line that we've marked here on the map. Specifically from this area up here. As we'll see, the situation there is completely different. We haven't seen a single Russian video from that specific area showing a flag being raised. Yes, we've seen individual Russian soldiers who were attacked there. No fortified positions there. This is the video we're now watching. Let's go back to the beginning. This is a video from the 7th Corps. It shows residential buildings in Pokrovsk, another district within the city. Now we zoom in, Ukrainians are zooming in right here. And to our surprise, we can see that this building apparently isn't occupied by Russian soldiers, but look here, by Ukrainian soldiers from the 7th Brigade. All these recordings are consistent with the Ukrainian claim that they continue to hold the northern parts of the city, specifically everything lying north of the railway line. We can see on the deep state map that even the pro-Ukrainian activists aren't completely certain about the situation, as they've clearly marked the entire area as contested, shown in orange rather than liberated in blue or left unmarked, meaning it was never occupied by Russia, but this whole thing shows us that the Russian claim of having full control over the entire city doesn't seem to hold true, because just north of it we do have some areas where Ukrainian troops are still holding out. They also say they made sure that they fulfill operational security, so-called OPSEC. Everything's been observed here, which of course could mean this building isn't under Ukrainian control permanently, because otherwise they'd be bombed right here. Nevertheless, we see the claim that Putin's man has captured or liberated the entire city, as Mr. Peskov wrongly called it. That doesn't seem to be true, as we still have at least a presence of Ukrainian soldiers in the northern part of the city, and we don't have the situation where the Russians are waving all their flags. These are just propaganda stunts, not actually showing themselves north of the railway so far either. But we're staying in the Donetsk region, moving further into the area around the city of Lyman. There too, we continue to see ongoing Russian activity and have further proof that North Korea is still actively supplying weapons to the Russian army. We have a Ukrainian drone attack here with a clearly fiber optic guided drone, so the signal quality doesn't degrade as it approaches the ground or flies through all these trees. And here we can see a Russian army off-road vehicle from which 2 Russian soldiers are about to jump out. And now the first impact occurs right here in this vehicle. However, we can soon see that after the vehicle has burned out, the Ukrainians realized it wasn't just a simple off-road vehicle, but a North Korean Type 75 multiple rocket launcher being transported, which the Ukrainians then also attack here and destroy it. These small rocket launchers can actually be disassembled pretty easily and then reinstalled on other vehicles to be used again. So here we see Ukraine launching an attack on that highly recognizable North Korean artillery system with multiple drones engaging from various directions in order to ensure, for instance, that holes are put in the barrels, effectively rendering them completely unusable for attacks against Ukrainian units. This whole situation shows us that North Korea is still active, not currently with soldiers, but with weapons over in eastern Ukraine, continuing to support Russia in its invasion of its neighboring country. But Russia is also still making ongoing efforts to disrupt Ukraine's logistics operations. We know that the Ukrainians, and we noticed this ourselves in September, have interconnected most of the roads within the first roughly 20-30 kilometers from the front. So these fish nets or various other nets, also donated from Germany, by the way, have been installed here to allow safer movement. The Russians have now tried to find a way to counter this. Here we see one of these roads in a town in the Donetsk region that's completely covered with nets. So we can clearly see how these nets have been set up here as protection against kamikaze drones, with vehicles moving carefully underneath. Here, for instance, we see one passing slowly through. The Russians have now brought back a relatively old weapon we discussed about a year ago, the so-called Dragon drones, which are essentially thermite-armed bombing drones that don't carry just one single heavy payload, but instead drag along a sort of container that becomes chemically activated while still in midair, thereby setting off this intense burning fire, and it gets spit down, meaning this thermite solution. Here we see a kind of thermite cannon. So what's it used for? These nets are being targeted, meaning the Russians are attempting to burn the nets that protect these roads. Mostly it's civilian nets, which burn relatively easily, and apparently this is the Russian attempt to keep disrupting logistics by targeting indirect infrastructure, since they can't directly reach those roads and are thus forced to proceed in this indirect and sustained manner, setting fires to make life even harder for both civilians and soldiers, all while creating the ongoing opportunity to target each of these individual roads once more with their FPV drones, either radio-controlled or fiber-optic guided drones, carrying out highly precise and targeted strikes to destroy Ukrainian vehicles before they ever make it to the front lines. From Donetsk, we head over to Dnipro, located in the eastern central part of the country. Here, the Russian army continued pushing further and further ahead, had taken the highly strategic location. Pokrovsk, not Pokrovsk, but Pokrovsk had already pushed forward to within 6 kilometers, securing a foothold just outside the town. And interestingly, we've just received some new footage from Tyche yesterday, this time not a déjà vu from the 21st November, 2 weeks ago, when Russians rode in, but Ukrainian footage instead, showing us exactly what they claimed with it, namely that they captured Tyche. We're seeing these various clips once again from the Russian army, but now released by the Ukrainian army. And this video is quite interesting because it shows us, first of all, that the Russians didn't just pull off a flag stunt here, they actually had control of the village. Because afterwards the Ukrainians arrived, saw Russian soldiers moving around here, taking shelter in the houses, in the abandoned houses of Tyche. Right now we're going to see how the Ukrainian army launches an attack on these abandoned houses here. And this whole situation is quite interesting because we haven't received any update from our map provider, Deep State Map, for this region. That means we previously didn't even have this area marked in orange, let alone in red, just left it completely unmarked, which clearly indicated that at least the Deep State Map activists hadn't received any up-to-date information at all. So they actually harbored doubts about whether the Russians had really ridden in here and temporarily occupied this village. These footage provided by the Ukrainian army clearly confirm that, though. We're now seeing drone attacks on Tyche coming from the Ukrainian side, and then right after, we also see Ukrainian infantrymen. Here we see them moving in on the ground, attacking the houses. A really interesting scene unfolding here. Apparently the drone strike caused the roof to collapse and consequently also brought down the access to the basement here. That means the Ukrainians are now trying to clear all the rubble here first, but then immediately shoot into the basement entrance because they suspect Russian soldiers are inside. We've just seen it there on the surveillance footage or the video that was captured by the drones. It's clear that Russian soldiers were holed up here, meaning the door was definitely open since the 21st. But the situation on the ground has changed quite considerably since that point in time. The Ukrainians have managed to retake it all, not just using drones, but also with infantry troops. And now we see similar buildings, or at least some buildings, completely destroyed in Tyche. And now we no longer see the Russian flag, but instead the Ukrainian flag being raised here by the specific unit that was operating there and has successfully retaken Tyche. And this was really important for the region because Tyche, as mentioned earlier, is just 6 kilometers away from Pokrovsk. Let's take a closer look at this on the map. Russia was now well within striking distance of this highly important and strategically vital city. We zoom into the map, go to the Dnipropetrovsk region, and see here, as just announced, that Tyche is not in the combat zone at all according to this map. However, it does seem she's being very, very conservative here, to say the least, almost a bit pro-Ukrainian. Well, we are dealing with Ukrainian activists who are editing this map here after all, because we assume this whole area, that all the villages south of that, meaning this entire area here is also under Russian control. We can clearly see that the Ukrainians have just managed to recapture Tyche. That's exactly where they carried out a counterattack. However, in the other villages here, specifically Novo-Oleksandrivka and Oleksivka, we haven't seen any Ukrainian soldiers there since that time. That means we assume this area here was the front line, the furthest advance of the Russian army, which is fortunately back under Ukrainian control now. We also have the situation where Russia has claimed that it already holds control over the area of Vidratne here. We've shown it, videos from there, don't know the current situation on the ground. We do see, however, that the defenders of Pokrovsk are still fully capable of launching attacks against the Russian army forces. And we've also seen that the Russians were relatively thinly spread here with just 2, 3, 4 soldiers in each individual settlement. There was clearly a serious shortage on the Ukrainian side, simply no infantry soldiers left to defend this area. Now it seems there's been some kind of shift happening here, perhaps even a rotation of units taking place. And now the Ukrainian army is trying once again to regain control over these villages. From Dnipropetrovsk in southeastern Ukraine, we head further south into the Zaporizhia region. Russia is also trying to push forward there. First, let's take a look at new videos of another failed Russian armored advance. Here we can see a T-72 and a BMP-2 being used in an attempt to advance toward Malotokmachka, another town in the area, once again trying to close in on Ukrainian positions. But we also see a successful Ukrainian counterattack here, specifically this one. Yes, both vehicles heavily up-armored, these so-called bristle armor, in this case bristle infantry fighting vehicles. Here the BMP-2, which is also under attack by the Ukrainian army, and you can clearly see that both vehicles were brought to a halt practically right next to each other, positioned side by side. We see it from different angles. Hope it's clear here. So here on the left, the T-72, which isn't on fire yet, and on the right, the BMP-2. Now we're also seeing secondary explosions there. That means we assume there was ammunition inside, so this infantry fighting vehicle was meant to be a fighting vehicle, not just an armored personnel carrier. And we can clearly see the Ukrainians now, after they managed to destroy the BMP-2, more and more secondary explosions clearly visible here as well. Once again, here's the BMP-2, which is already burning, and over here the T-72, which hasn't caught fire yet. So you'd then shift focus to the next vehicle to make absolutely sure the Russians can't recover anything here. So they can't salvage it and later reuse these two vehicles elsewhere for another attack. We can see here the Ukrainians are extremely thorough. They apparently also have the resources and drone capabilities to completely destroy both vehicles one after the other, to make sure, as I said, that this was the last time they were used here. All of this taking place in Zaporizhia, meaning we're once again observing Russia attempting to push forward using various methods, whether it's infantry, as seen in Huliaipol, or here further south with armored vehicles. So the Russian offensive continues in the south of the country as well. Let's take another look at the situation in Huliaipol on the map. Let's focus on the situation in the south for now. I think we can leave it like this for the moment. The video we just saw actually came mostly from this particular region, specifically this area here near Orikhiv. In Huliaipol, the situation is different. There, we haven't seen any tanks from the Russian army in recent days. However, as you can clearly see on the map, we're now facing a situation where the very first neighborhoods of Huliaipol, located right here in the southeast of the city, are already at least contested and under pressure. We've seen various videos from that area showing how Ukrainian bomber drones are actively attacking the residential buildings there. So we assume, and the map reflects this as well, which is why I'm saying it's extremely up to date in this case, while in other cases the map isn't quite as current, that Huliaipol is already partially at least contested, and that the Russians are trying to push further into the city here on the ground. Now let's take a look at the actual combat unfolding in the skies over Ukraine. We've got some new footage here from the Russian side, which shows clearly that a Spear drone was deployed, a type of quadcopter, to take down a Ukrainian Darts drone, which is a fixed-wing model, by successfully intercepting it in midair. and we can clearly see the entire incident unfolding right here. It partially succeeds because we can still make out quite clearly the target. That's the Ukrainian darts drone, which has a range of about 15 to 20 kilometers. A kamikaze drone, and we can clearly see how the Russians are attacking here, stabbing in with these two spears. Now we see it. However, the biggest damage we can already see on the left and right isn't caused by the spears, but by the rotors. That means we're seeing the darts drone slowly start to lose control. And again, you can clearly see the camera and everything as it starts to crash down. And we can clearly see that she's actually pulling the Russian attacker down with her as well. Here you can see it again quite clearly. Once more, most of the damage isn't actually caused by these two small spears, but rather the wings of the darts drone are completely torn apart on both sides due to the impact from the drone's spinning rotors of the attacking drone. However, the Russians are trying to portray the whole thing as a successful mission, suggesting they basically survived it and they cut away right at the crucial moment. We actually believe that the Russian drone ultimately ends up crashing and being completely destroyed here in just the same way as the Ukrainian one. And you can see that especially in the final moments, because right now the drone briefly disengages from its attacker, and we see it here in the last moment. There, the drone is clearly visible again. Explodes completely in midair, thereby also destroying the controls of the attacking drone. As I said, the Russians are now cutting away quickly, precisely to avoid showing that they've also crashed. We do assume, however, that at the end of the intense air battle, both drones, Ukrainian and Russian alike, ultimately ended up crashing down to the ground. Not just Russia uses interceptor drones, Ukraine does too, of course. Here we have fresh and previously unseen footage from the 95th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, and this unit has clearly, as we'll see demonstrated here, made it their focus to intercept these Shahed drones, these Shahed 136, or as the Russians call them, Geran-2 drones, out of the sky. According to their own reports, the 95th has shot down 100 Shaheds over Ukraine. To mark the occasion, they've now released this video showing us roughly, I'm not exactly sure, maybe about 20 of them, or 25 of these shootdowns. And once again, we can clearly see here, all of these attacks were actually carried out using unmanned drones. In any case, they flew either above or below the Russian drone, attacked it in the sky over Ukraine at 2 to 3 or 4 kilometers altitude, and we can clearly see the Ukrainians have become extremely efficient at intercepting Russian Shahed drones. Of course, you can say that hundreds still get through every week, yeah, but it would be thousands if Ukraine weren't dealing with it in precisely this manner right now. That means alongside the very, very expensive Western air defense systems, some of which the German military now wants to acquire, interceptor jets are particularly effective against these Russian kamikaze drones, and especially low-cost interceptor jets. Each of the ones we've just seen costs a maximum of 5,000 euros per drone to contain this Russian threat in the skies over Ukraine. From the skies over Ukraine down into the Black Sea, off the coast of Crimea, occupied by Russia since 2014. Here we have new footage showing quite clearly how the Ukrainian army is now deploying their so-called Magura Sea drones, specifically targeting helicopters, or at least aerial targets, in the Black Sea. Because now we're seeing the approach of a Russian Lancet drone, that is a kamikaze drone, which interestingly here doesn't have any target on the ground, but rather carries out attacks at sea. And from these images we can clearly see that the Russians are also using drones to defend against other drones here. That's quite interesting, that it's no longer people fighting on the front lines, but purely remote operations. And on the other hand, we can clearly see that this particular Magura 5-7 was actually carrying 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles on both sides here, meaning the whole idea was to take out an enemy helicopter by using this drone as a weapon platform, or aircraft or other low-flying targets. Given that the Lancet drone is traditionally too small to be detected by a Sidewinder, it stayed undetected throughout and therefore simply couldn't be shot down under any circumstances. Here we can clearly see the Lancet drone slowly coming in toward the ship, and now we're about to see how the impact here triggers at least one of the missiles. I think now it's pretty obvious right here. We see it. The rocket's exhaust, the propulsion basically backfires. The Magura drone starts spinning pretty rapidly, and because of the damage it just sustained, it goes down within just a few seconds. But this shows us, now we see it, how the Magura sinks here. This whole thing shows, of course, that Ukraine is carrying its fight further toward the Crimea, further toward Russian reconnaissance. And of course, it also shows us that the Russians have responded by no longer patrolling here with Mi-8 or Ka-52 helicopters, but that meanwhile, various drone systems are also being increasingly deployed in this area. Unmanned platforms that are now responsible not only for reconnaissance missions over the Black Sea, but also for carrying out attacks on Ukrainian targets there. Finally, let's take a look at the latest Russian terrorist attacks, which are truly growing in scale and becoming increasingly devastating in Ukraine. On Friday, it was once again more than 650 drones, rockets, cruise missiles, and other similar weapons launched. And here, among other things, the railway station in Fastiv, a city with a population of 44,000 located southwest of Kiev, was attacked. And we're seeing these images here. This kind of thing hasn't happened before. We've seen attacks on trains and stations in the eastern part of the country. But now, in the western part of the country, we're seeing attacks on actual trains, electric trains, depots, and railway stations. This here is the main station hall. This is actually a whole new level of Russian terror. We can clearly see how severe the destruction is here. These were all regional trains that had been parked there. 1, 2, 3. We see at least that many, all completely destroyed by the Russians. These are clearly not military targets, but entirely civilian ones. That means outright war crimes committed by Russia in a deliberate attempt to immobilize the population in that region, to unsettle them, and of course to stir them up against the government as well, clearly. Here's another before and after build where you can clearly see the courtyard of Fastiv and how it typically looks under normal circumstances. It's just a completely normal civilian facility in the middle of Ukraine, and here the destruction caused to the station's main hall by the Russian attack. This whole thing is a kind of pattern, really a clear pattern we've seen in recent days, civilian infrastructure being targeted far away from the front lines. But also, for instance, the hospital depot located in Lviv was attacked on the 28th November, which was supposed to supply 600 hospitals across the entire country. Medical supplies were destroyed here, items that aren't only meant for military operations, but also for people suffering from cancer or similar kinds of illnesses. Yesterday, or on Friday, they struck the local hospital distribution hub in Dnipro once more, really driving home the point that absolutely no medicine should get through to the suffering population. And in Dnipro, the post was attacked as well, Nova Poshta, where there was a major distribution center. Russia absolutely hates Nova Poshta. This crucial postal network delivers not only to civilians, but also essential non-lethal supplies to the entire army of 1 million soldiers spread across the country. Meaning no weapons, but things like helmets, night vision devices, and so on, supplies delivered by Nova Poshta. They're extremely active there. You can actually see it. You can even deliver supplies to villages right at the front line while troops are actively deployed. It's one of the best networks operating throughout entire Ukraine, set up to supply soldiers with civilian goods, but also, of course, to support civilians. And on social media, there was massive protest and great distress here because over 10,000 deliveries to civilians, to completely ordinary private individuals, were destroyed in these attacks. That means Russia is really attacking the entire Ukrainian population, the entire civilian population. 10,000 people who no longer receive their deliveries or packages from their loved ones. So yet another point showing how Russia is truly planning and steadily pushing forward the total destruction of Ukraine.